We know that they have the biggest electricity vehicle in whole Europe, and they continue to have an economic growth. Their GDP has been increased significantly despite applying this policy. And what we understand is that if the policy is applied correctly, if it is well studied before the application and well administered by the policymakers, it will result in reducing the carbon emissions significantly. And also, if this carbon tax revenue will provide a good source of investment which facilitate the country's transition to a low carbon technology. It is important to know that the carbon tax should be accompanied by a revenue recycling approach. We know imposing a carbon tax reduces carbon emissions, but as an additional tax, it will hurt the economy. We want the economy to continue to grow, so we want so the carbon tax should be accompanied by a revenue recycling approach, meaning that all the carbon tax revenue should be redirected back into the economy. Studies has shown that we must follow a revenue neutral approach, meaning that nothing should be added to government revenue and all the carbon tax should be redirected back to the economy. It must be used as a supporter of total consumption. It must be transferred to households or decline in income taxes in order to save the total consumption in the country. And it must be invested in R&D projects because we want to facilitate our transition toward net zero. We want to have enough fund to find new ways to reduce our consumption, and it must be supported by this fund. All the studies that has been done and all the countries that has been applied the policy correctly and have studied before the application of the policy learn us that if the carbon tax is accompanied by a revenue recycling approach and it is designed correctly, will create new job opportunities. Then the carbon tax revenue can be used to upskill the workforce. It can be used to provide loan to industries to substitute their old technologies to new technologies, and it can provide a good source of investment. It can be used to promote the idea of the carbon tax to inform people and inform policymakers about the positive impacts of this policy, and it can accelerate the transition to low carbon technologies. The main point is that the policy should be country specific. It must be designed based on the economic structure of each country, and it must be something that it must be based on the social accounting matrix of each country. You cannot prescribe a policy that has been applied in, for example, a Western country to a country in Asia. But we know that this policy application of the carbon tax is positive in reducing carbon emissions. So we have to design, estimate the correct rate and design it correctly in order to achieve the goal of achieving net zero by the application of the policy. There are many things about the carbon tax that needs more investment and more study, but the point is it is one of our promising tools in combating climate change and reducing carbon emissions, and it seems to be one of the best approaches that we have in hand to overcome the problems that we have right now. Thank you for your time, and I'm done here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mona, for your insightful presentation. So we also have a Q&A session, but we hold the session until the end of the presentation. So we have the second speaker. This is actually our Ibu Luluk Widyawati, Ph.D., who is joining us in the room today. So Bu Luluk is a lecturer and program director of undergraduate program in accounting, Universitas Indonesia. She has completed her Ph.D. in sustainable finance from the University of Queensland, Australia in 2020. And she has several professional and industry experiences, as well as research papers related to sustainability. So for the audience, if you have any questions, maybe you can hold your question until the end, or for those who are joining on Zoom, you can just put the questions in the chat box. So let's welcome Ibu Luluk for the second session.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you Mona for the great presentation to start the discussion today on the need for certain policy in regard to the climate change mitigations and adaptation, especially in regard to the carbon tax in a way. So basically what I'm going to present today is on what is currently happening in Indonesia. I'm going to start with the context on what is Indonesia's carbon or emissions profile, how do we commit to our climate change mitigation actions, and then what are the mechanisms that currently being implemented or is being prepared to be implemented. And then we'll talk at the end about what accountants or accounting as a profession can do or can assist, or what are the role of the accounting professions within the scope of this market and non-market mechanism. So Mona has indicated the importance of climate change mitigation and adaptation. So I assume everyone here agree on it. Mona has also mentioned that almost all countries have some degree of initiatives for climate change mitigation and adaptations, and Indonesia as well has also created some initiatives for it. So, but let's look at what is the profile for Indonesia's carbon emissions. So if we move to the next one, we'll have here the picture of how Indonesia's per capita greenhouse gas emissions, and how does that relate to the economic development of Indonesia. So maybe let's start with what we have on the right-hand side. How does the growth in the GDP compare with the growth of emission, basically, carbon emissions? So we see here that the growth that we all enjoy, right? We all enjoyed the fast economic growth in the past few decades, from 1990s until now 2021, in terms of total GDP per capita. And then if we compare it with the line above, the red and the green line, we see that at the same time, the carbon emission per capita, meaning per person, actually increased with the same rate and even with the higher sort of level of growth. What can we see from this sort of data or graph? I know correlation doesn't mean causation, but at least we know that there seems to be a correlation, right? Seems like our growth so far, our economic growth so far is so tied up with the economic activities that actually emit significant amount of emissions. So we can simplify it by asking questions. What have we done in terms of our economic growth? Have we sacrificed our environmental and sustainability for the sake of economic growth, right? So that's the questions that we can maybe infer from this graph of GDP and emission per capita. And if we compare compare it with our neighbors, right? We always like to compare with our neighbors. What happened with our neighbors in terms of per capita greenhouse? Maybe, oh yeah, man, we're still in the second place, right? There's someone else higher than us, but still, if we look up at our neighbors, we're still in somewhat higher level positions if we compare with the Philippines, for example, and Thailand, which has shown, especially Philippines, that has shown sort of decline in the per capita emissions over the years since 1980s, while at the same time we actually peaked in our emissions even more than Malaysia at some point in the 2000s, sorry. So, I mean, we see that emission is a very significant part of our economy in Indonesia. And even compared with our neighbor in Southeast Asia, we are still among one of probably the highest emitters per capita within the region. So that's maybe just opening that carbon is important within Indonesian context. In the next slide, we'll see where does all of these emissions came from. These emissions came from one of the main things is the land use and also electricity. So if we see on the left-hand side with all the bar chart with the blue color, you can see all the component, all the industries that actually contribute to the Indonesia's emissions. This one is at 2022. So we see land use change, basically the change of forest to become non-forest. It might be for energy, might be for oil and gas, might be for agriculture, or even for real estates, because nowadays many sort of home being built surrounding the forested area with new, with the number of populations growing, obviously we need more and more land to build homes and so on. So that's possibly one of the reasons. But again, this shows some of the most significant industry, including maybe the one that affects everyone here, electricity. So obviously we, in the past, we've been so used to enjoy electricity quite cheaply, which is possibly due to the use of cheap coal that we actually produce here in Indonesia, but obviously that contributes to the environmental impact toward the economy. And we also have problems with waste, right? Now waste is becoming more and more critical as an issue. I assume everyone here, if you're in Indonesia or if Mona is still here, in Indonesia, especially in social media or in mass media, almost every week you have news that the last, what do you call it, TPA, the last sort of mass waste processing center, almost all big processing center in Java has been on near full capacity. What's going on with what's happening with all of these waste? Obviously, all these waste, if you just put it on top of each other one way or another, they will emit gases such as carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and also methane, which is one of the biggest greenhouse gas emissions. And we see here some of the industry. Why this identification is important? Because later on, this identification is really useful to create some sort of strategy. So, which industry that we should prioritize on in terms of creating some sort of mechanism, right? In creating incentives or disincentive for them to do some climate change mitigations and adaptations. And we see energy as one of the main, right? Electricity and so on. Energy become one of the main main source of greenhouse gas emissions for Indonesia. And one of them is because the carbon intensity of our energy production in Indonesia is among the highest within the Southeast Asia. If we compare with the Philippines, again, Malaysia and Thailand, we're actually the first. It means that we need more carbon for every unit of energy that we consume, that we produce, right? So that's become a concern as well. And again, this will become one of the reasons why energy sector become one of the priority for the government in creating their climate change mitigations and adaptation mechanisms. And we see here as well, if we look at the energy sources, we have coal, oil, gas, and flaring. We see a growing dominance of coal since 1980s. And if we compare it with the growth of carbon intensity over the period in the graph next to it, we can see that there is an increasing trend of Indonesia's carbon intensity since like 2000s and since the period of 1990s, 2000s and onwards. And if we compare it with the increasing sort of use of coal and oil in the next graph, we sort of can see, again, correlation, maybe not causations, but yes, it seems to be a link there, which is, again, maybe more evidence needs to be pursued if we want to prove some causations, but we seem to see the link. So again, energy, agriculture, land use, waste become some of the main industry to be concerned about if we're talking about emissions. And how do other people look at our carbon emissions and compare it with our strategy? Unfortunately, we're still among, maybe not the worst, we're somewhere in the middle. We're in the rank 26th out of 52, so right there in the middle, right? You're not like the best, but we're not also the worst, but we are right there in the middle. We see that the CCPI, they have these indicators to see how much is the emissions and how much that the country actually sort of attempt, or how much is the country sort of commit to the nationally determined contribution, basically how much they plan to reduce the emissions over the years. And we see that in this part with the target comparison on the right-hand side of the figures here, we see that the graph, the green graph, the green line on this right-hand side graph, it's actually below what needs to be done if we really want to achieve the target emissions stated by the Paris Agreement. So the green line is the actual total emissions of Indonesia, and the yellow dot, that is the emissions being committed by Indonesia nationally determined contribution, basically Indonesian commitment at 2030 and then 2050 and 2060, obviously they have the data. But if we look at the graph, it's actually still below what it needs to be done, what it needs to be committed in order for us to achieve 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius of change. So that's just to show how important is climate change mitigations and climate change adaptations in regard to emissions in Indonesia. So that's just to show, build the context. And what's currently, as I mentioned, Indonesia have committed to do something, and that commitment is stated, ratified in a document called Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC, which is a form of commitment that every country has to submit to the UNFCCC as part of their effort, the joint effort of all countries in the world to reduce emissions. as per the goal targeted by the Paris Agreement. So after we have the Kyoto Protocol and possibly one of the big, the most significant sort of movement or become the most significant stage. Here is the Paris Agreement, where it is adopted by 195 or 194 countries in the world. And every country that have said that they adopt the Paris Agreement, they have signed the Paris Agreement, they have to submit what they call as nationally determined contribution. Basically in that they say, okay, this is what we think we can do in terms of how much that we can reduce of our emissions over the next 20 up until 2030, 2050, 2060, and so on. So Indonesia has submitted the nationally determined contribution 3 times. So first in 2016, directly after the Paris Agreement. Second in 2021, which is sort of updated, after the COVID, with a lot more data being available, with a lot more disclosure, a lot more information being collected, and so on. The Indonesia changed and their commitment, and then they submitted the updated NDC, and then just 1 year afterward, they submitted a new one, right? They submitted the enhanced NDC. Basically, one of the major change is in the update in terms of how much percentage that Indonesia would try or would target or would committed to achieve within the next until 2030, the next few years until 2030. So this is the difference in terms of data, Indonesia's NDC commitment since the first NDC until the very last NDC. And we can see here one of the big difference is the percentage of the emission that the countries say they would like to reduce over the years. And this is the target that they will have in 2030. And you can see here there is 2 components, which is unconditional and conditional. The unconditional is the reduction of emissions if Indonesia is, on their own doing it, right? Without any sort of interventions whatsoever from the international market. So it's purely based on Indonesia's initiatives. With the new enhanced NDC, we targeted, or Indonesia have a target of reduction of emission reductions up to 31.89% at 2030. But if we got some interventions, if we got some assistance, if we got some help from international due to the finance, technology, and so on, Indonesia's government said they are confident to reduce it further, which is higher, up until 43.2%. So again, this is already become a target, and it is already sort of formalized, become a real formal document that the government has to show and has to somehow report on their progress on. So this is a target. And I mentioned before about the industry. So when they set a target, here they have a target of reduction 31.89 and 43.2. Where does the reductions came from? So again, because in the previous slide I showed some of the industry that become the most the major contributors to the emissions in Indonesia. So this industry become the main focus of the climate change mitigation and adaptation. So energy, waste, agriculture, forestry, and other land use as well. So that's just to show you here, if we can see which one that become the main sort of player, or which industry that would seems to be the main focus. If we see in the table, the main focus are two industries, which is the first, energy, because the significant amount of reductions coming from the energy, and another one is forest, and another one again is for agriculture and waste. So forestry, kehutanan, and energy, kelistrikan, become the two main industry that become the focus of this strategy, Indonesia strategy in fulfilling this emissions goal. So how does that being translated into the coordination between ministry, who are responsible over it? So many parties become responsible over it, but the one thing that we clearly see from this diagram is that private sector needs to have a significant contribution as well, in addition to the public sector or the government. As you can see here, almost in every part, you have the private sector or sector swasta here that is expected to provide certain contribution in terms of carbon reductions or emission reductions. And you can see here as well, for different sectors, there are different ministry and different parties that will be responsible. Like the agriculture, obviously you have the ministry related to the environment and forestry. You have the energy, obviously your energy and mineral resources ministry, and so on. So this is just to show you who are responsible over the strategy. And remember, with the NDC, what they mention is how much that you want to reduce by 2030. 2030. But then, if we want to achieve net zero emissions, basically if we emit the emissions and we sort of offset all of the emissions, or even we reduce the emissions to the point where we achieve net zero, the ministry, in this case Bappenas, Ministry of Planning, have actually done some analysis in which they have these scenarios whether they can do it in 2050, 2060, 70, 80, and so on. And what they decided is that, okay, based on all these scenarios, they feel confident, or the government feel confident, that we will have a net zero by 2060. So 2060. So yes, we want to reduce emissions by certain target by 2030, but we plan to have a further target by 2060 of net zero emissions. But then obviously again, all of these are target, goals in 2030 and 2060, but what are the mechanisms to achieve this nationally determined contributions and also all of this net zero target? So this slide showing what are the strategy of the governments, how the Indonesian government as the main party involved created a set of framework, a set of connected initiatives where the government as well as private sectors working together to reduce emission and try to achieve the target emission as per stated in the NDC. And maybe for the sake of today, one thing that I want to focus on is the NEK, or nilai ekonomi carbon, which is one of the main strategy being used, meaning that Indonesia is committed to create a mechanism to ensure that there will be carbon economic value, right? And the carbon economic value is being formalized through the Presidential Decree number 98 year 2021. So the President has published or has issued a decree, some sort of at the level of below certain state law. So the presidents have published this presidential decree number 98, which stated 4 mechanism that Indonesia will implement in order to ensure that there will be a carbon economic value being implemented. One of them is the carbon market, and another form is carbon sort of tax. Here it said the pungutan atas carbon, which is basically carbon tax. So that's sort of the formal law in a way that stated that Indonesia will adopt both market and non-market mechanisms. So carbon trading is sort of a market mechanism, and performance-based payment as also and carbon tax is considered as non-market mechanism. So Indonesia is committed to implement both. But how far have we done in terms of our journey for this market and non-market mechanism? So obviously you have this presidential decree, but then there needs to be a lot of other sort of technical law guidelines, standards from the relevant ministry. So here are some of the regulation that has been published in Indonesia, including from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, Ministry of Environment, and also the newest one in 2023 is from the Financial Services Authority in regard to the opening of Indonesian Carbon Exchange. Again, this is what has been published, this is what has been done, but the journey is still in its infancy. We still need quite a lot of publication to be published in order for us to have a complete setup of market and non-market mechanism being implemented. These are the list of the additional regulations that's currently in the process that is necessary for the implementation, such as the roadmap for the carbon trading and carbon tax. So there needs to be a roadmap. There needs also some roadmap for international carbon trading, because we hope that our carbon exchange will not only serve domestic market but can also serve international market, become one of the region most important carbon market. Also, probably one thing that is become one of the big discussion is the regulation in regard to the carbon tax, because yes, there's one regulations about that, the commitment to introduce carbon tax, but then the very specific sort of detailed standard and guideline and regulations has not been published by the Ministry of Finance. So that's still wait. We still need to look it up in some of the discussions on what's going on later on. And then there also needs to be some improvement and some integrations of the national registry. So basically, in order for all this market and non-market mechanism to be implemented, there needs to be a registry, meaning both parties that have or would like to sell carbon or have access of carbon quota or have a project that are eligible for carbon certificate, they have to register in the National Register program called SRN-PPI. And for those companies who need this carbon certificate, they also need to register in that national register. So that's some of the potential regulation that will come up in the future and currently still in process. So again, this just to show you what are the mechanisms So you have the mechanism again involved with number 1 here in green, which is the carbon trading, as you have the number 3 here, which is the carbon tax. We probably will focus on those 2 discussions because the payment-based or performance-based payment and other mechanisms are generally sort of a G2G progress, like RETG plus and so on. So that's mainly it. But the one that's most relevant for private sectors, especially in regard to the direct costs and so on, are probably the carbon market in terms of carbon exchange and also in terms of carbon tax. So again, this is just a brief glance on how the carbon sort of market or carbon economic value is going to be implemented in Indonesia. One of the most important things here is again the need to be registered in the national registry system, and also some other sort of app and some other databases, just to make sure that the carbon certificate can be then verified, can be monitored, and then those verified certificate can be traded within the carbon market. So that's just a brief glance. I'm not going to really explain in detail. We probably won't really have that much of a time, but if you want to see it, it's available in the documents provided by the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources. So we're moving toward one of probably the most recent development in terms of market and non-market mechanism. I know Mona has explained that carbon tax become one of the most efficient policy in regard to the climate change mitigation and adaptations. And as Mona also indicated, it's very, very difficult to sort of pursue, or very difficult to persuade the political parties, the people involved, to implement carbon tax. So in Indonesia, carbon tax is yet to be implemented. So yes, we do have carbon tax plan to be implemented in 2025, but we're still waiting for some of the detailed guidelines on it. But the one that we have and just launched in September, so it's just recently being launched, is the Indonesia Carbon Exchange, or IDX Carbon. So it's now being managed by the Indonesian Stock Exchange as IDX Carbon. And in the IDX Carbon, the one they trade is 3 sort of products. So they can trade, two products. So they can trade allowance and they can trade credits. So allowance means that some companies might have, or some companies, due to the regulations, might have a cap or quota, or the maximum amount of emission that they can emit as a company or as in that industry, and obviously that will be based on some regulations, and some industry are still waiting for that regulations. But if their actual emission is lower than their maximum emission, than their cap or than their quota, so they still have sort of a quota available, right? So if the maximum emission is like 1 million ton for that company in that industry, for example, then if the company's actual emission is, let's say, 700,000 ton, they still have 300,000 quota or left for emission. So they can actually trade that excess emission quota in the market. So that's, they call as allowance. So there's excess allowance for emissions. Or some other parties can also trade carbon credits. Carbon credits is coming from seller who can prove that their activities is actually reducing emissions. So it can be coming from reforestry project, It can be coming from carbon sequestrations project. So because they absorb emissions, so they can sell the amount that they absorb as carbon certificate for certain companies that actually need that certificate. So that's the two main products being traded. So again, this is just a short overview of the market itself. So you have allowances and then you have offset, but there are also different ways to get that. Different ways for the buyers and sellers to get their credits or to sell their credit. So there are four mechanisms in the market. One is auctions, meaning that the seller can offer, oh, I have this amount of carbon credit, and offer it in the auctions, and then the buyer will sort of, present their offer for that specific credit. So that's auctions. Or they can have a regular trading. Basically, it's just like, trading of stocks. They just list the carbon credit within the market, and they'll just wait to see how much the market will actually price that a certificate. Or they can have the negotiated trading between these two buyers and sellers, or even they can have some sort of a marketplace. So the one that's currently, because again, this is still pretty new, so it just launched in September. So the one that's currently happening is just the regular trading. We haven't had a data for the other type or the other mechanism for the carbon market. So what we currently have in the trading in the IDX carbon is only the regular trading. So pretty much like trading stock exchange, in the regular stock exchange. So the seller listed the credits, sort of like a lot of stocks, but here you have a lot of carbon credits, right? And then just see how much the buyer would like to buy that carbon credit in the market. So that's just four mechanisms. As I mentioned before, Indonesia also committed to implement carbon tax, but it is postponed. So it was planned to be implemented in 2021, but due to a lot of considerations, one of them is obviously COVID, and others, the implementation is being postponed to 2025. So next 2 years, we should have the carbon tax, hopefully, if nothing goes wrong. Obviously, we will have a new government as well in place. So we'll see what's going to happen in 2025. And the one that's already mentioned in the tax law, the revised tax law, is how much the minimum price. So again, the tax here mentioned is that the rate will not be less than 30 rupiah per kilogram. So that's the minimum. It can be more than that, but that's the minimum. So is the one that they show here is what will be the minimum. But then the rate itself will be discussed further, and we still wait on how much it's actually going to be, because there are some critics that say that 30 per kilogram is much lower than what it's supposed to be. Some say that it's supposed to be 75, some say it's supposed to be 50. So again, there will be some more discussions. And when should they pay? They can pay that at the end of each calendar year, or upon the purchase of goods containing carbon. When you purchase let's say coal or other goods containing carbon, then you have to pay the tax, for example. Or there will be other timing as determined by the government regulations. And again, we still currently waiting for that regulation coming out from the Ministry of Finance. Hopefully it will come out during next year, because if we want to implement this in 2025, so at least it should come out in end of 2024 or beginning 2025. Depends on the month as well. But yeah, that's just one of the evidence as well, at least on what Mona has said, that implementing carbon tax is very difficult. In Indonesia, we also face that issue. So how do accountants will need to be involved within all this carbon market and within all this carbon tax and so on? Obviously, let's start with the management accounting. because management accounting is usually more involved with the changes. They have to recalculate all the costs and such, and they will be the one who help the management in making decisions on what initiatives they need to be done in reducing the emissions, right? So we have this carbon management accounting sort of topic or issue or field within the accounting area, where it's basically about measurement and analysis of organization carbon emissions and also associated costs. So if you have carbon tax, then you need to include that within your cost and benefit analysis. For example, if you want to build a new facility, if you want to buy a new machine, if you want to expand your product into new area, what type of carbon related costs that will be involved and so on, and how does that include within your cost benefit analysis. That's basically carbon management accounting. It's basically to support decision making of the company. So it can help the organization to understand what is their carbon footprint, and then understand how is the most, or what is the most efficient tools for them to actually address the climate change risk. Because obviously with the climate change, in addition to the impact that each company will have toward the environment through emissions, but the physical risk of climate change and the transition risk of climate change will also affect the company one way or another, direct or indirectly. So the company have to actually account for that within their decision making. So the management accounting is the one who can help with all the frameworks that's available, with all the experience that accountants have in coordinating data regarding costs and so on, to support decision making within the company. Possibly, if you're talking about accounting, many people are sort of more interested or more familiar with financial accounting, right? And this is a journal that published within the Journal of Business Ethics just recently, 2023, to show how the Korean emission trading affect the accounting, financial accounting standards in Korea, because one of the country in Asia that has implemented emission trading system is Korea. In addition to European Union, in Europe obviously, but we have Korea that just recently implemented their ETS. So we have this all of concerns. It's probably not as clear for those of you that physically being here, but if you are joining in Zoom, you can zoom it out, the slide. So obviously some implication includes the timing between the financial reporting and the timeline of the carbon market and carbon tax, some issue with recognitions of emission rights, as the cost as well as the cost as well. How does the reporting and disclosure for it? So again, if you are later on get the slide, you can look it up in more detail. But they have summarized some of the methods, financial accounting methods that has been implemented in several parts of the world. Obviously, different countries in the world have started to implement emission trading system. So some other countries in the world have experience in how this carbon credits or carbon offset is being recorded in their financial statements, and the paper summarizes 3 methods that's available. For some issues, actually 2. So for example, for initial recognition, do we have it at cost or do we have it at market value, right? There is a market value here method, or do we have it at cost method, and how does fair value afterward if we still have the carbon credits, the subsequent measurements of it, again, of allowances, can it be at cost or can be market value, or can we do it through sort of impairment mechanisms, or is it going to be a fair value mechanism as of financial instruments, or should it be sort of a fair value impairment as of it is a non-current assets, for example? And then you have the liability for recognitions. If you have a liability, for example, if you already emit the carbon, right, and you know that there will be carbon tax being, need to be paid for that emissions, should you recognize the liability for that carbon tax when you emit the emissions or when you get the invoice from the Ministry of Finance, for example, right? When should you recognize the liability? So here, sometimes is when emission is occurred, sometimes is when emission are produced. How about the measurement? And then again, what about the presentation? So quite a lot of references actually have been published in this area. Almost all Big Four, PwC, KPMG, Deloitte, and Ernst & Young have also published some references in regard to this area. But again, this is just at a glance that accounting or accountant also have a role, especially financial accountant also will be affected one another, and their contributions will also be required to ensure that the market and non-market implementations will be implemented properly. And the last one is probably the one that almost everyone is quite familiar nowadays with, the disclosures. So after you have all these management accounting and financial accounting, obviously you need to put into your reporting. If it's about financial accounting, possibly you will see it in your financial statements. But what about other type of more detailed information that cannot be included within financial statements? One way is to include it in other type of disclosures. It can be in your annual report, it can be in your sustainability report, and so on. So how do you disclose that? An accountant should be more experienced in looking at where should we disclose, what should be disclosed, how we can ensure that the disclosure is actually reliable, accurate, and so on, including the role of the auditors, the auditing profession, to ensure that the statement, the self-assessment or the disclosure is actually being useful and also true to what being reported, including here. So you have two things: the standards for the reporting itself and the standard for the audit. With the standard of audit, it's actually pretty new, but we have quite a significant sort of movement coming out from the standard sector for the international standard audit, the body who actually issued international standard on audit. So they actually currently have a plan for International Standard on Sustainability Assurance, ISA 5000. It's still an ongoing process, and we'll see what's going on in the next few years, or maybe in the next few months. But what we have in Indonesia, interestingly, is the ERP, which is the Indonesian Associations for Public Accountant, is actually issuing some exposure draft specific for carbon credit. So the exposure draft is currently active. So if any one of you are interested to see what's actually the assurance standards, there is an opportunity to provide a comment on it in ERP website. But possibly the one that everyone is familiar with in regard to the reporting is the standards of sustainability disclosure. So this is just a summary of the standards currently being the development of the standards, with the GRI and the IFRS S1 and S2 become the possibly two main standards being expected to be implemented in the next futures. Obviously, in every jurisdictions, there might be some variations of the standards. One of the examples is the European Union, where in their jurisdictions, they decided to create their own standards, considering what IFRS and GRI have done, and they create the European Union sustainability reporting standard. So that's just to show how sort of confusing can be sustainability reporting standards, framework and development and so on, and accounting is one of the professions that have experience with reading and implementing standards. And also, obviously, one of the issuer of the standards is actually the IFRS, which is the body that also issued the financial accounting standards. So that's basically sort of conclude my presentations for today. So if everyone have any questions, then please welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Luluk, for your presentation. So, do we have any questions? Maybe I will give the chance first to participants who are joining in the room, if you have any questions. Let's see, on Zoom, I think we still have no question either, so yeah, maybe if anyone joining on the Zoom, if you have any questions or comments, you can free to talk or to unmute yourself. In Bahasa, it's okay. I will try to translate if the question is related to Mona, for example. Anyone? Okay, maybe while we are waiting, I have a question to Mona. So basically, you were talking about the carbon tax policy. So what factors that we need to consider to create like maybe effective carbon tax policy? Yeah, maybe it depends on the country or a culture, but based on your research or experience, what kind of maybe factors that we need to consider?
Thank you for your question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The factors that we have to consider is the economic structure of the country, because each country depends on different industries for the economic growth, and we have to consider these industries that are impacting the GDP growth of the country. So when we apply a policy, we have to consider this fact. For example, for Norway, which depends on natural resources for the export, they should follow another specific policy. But for example, in my study, I have covered 11 countries, and what I've saw was that, for example, in Ireland, they used the carbon tax to invest in the manufacturing industry because they didn't have any reliance on fossil fuels for their economic growth, but they were relying on manufacturing sector. In other fact, for Norway, they invested in renewable energies. They invested in their fossil fuel industries. They try to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels electricity sector. Based on the economic structure of each country, their dependence on different sources of revenue, the policy should be designed in a way that generates economic and environmental benefit for the country.
Okay, thank you. How about the maybe behavior of the company who produces the carbon itself? I mean, maybe some companies are reluctant, or maybe in a certain way.
This station is Gordon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So maybe in some situations, some companies are more preferable to pay the taxes rather than to reduce their emission. How would we prevent that, or how do we create the effective policy to discourage such behavior?
You know, in the study that I have done, I looked at the macroeconomic factors. Looking at the company level, it needs another understanding because it depends on the policy that has been applied for the companies. But we know that the carbon tax should be used to provide incentive for the companies to transition to low carbon technologies. And we can give loans to the companies and help them to get more information about how this transition will benefit them. And using this money will help them to manage their costs during this transition. This transition needs investment and knowledge, and this carbon tax revenue can be used to manage this cost and give them loans and incentives to follow this transition.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience, maybe? The audience on the Zoom? Oh, okay. Sorry.
Oke, terima kasih. Mungkin pertanyaan saya lebih untuk ke Bu Luluk. Yang pertama tadi terkait dengan tren ya yang disampaikan di beberapa slide awal, bahwa trennya itu adalah GDP-nya naik, itu emission-nya itu juga naik gitu. Nah ini kan sekarang targetnya adalah mau net zero emission. Walaupun tadi ya ini mungkin korelasi bukan causation gitu ya, cuma apakah nanti akan ada kemungkinan ketika upaya net zero ini berhasil atau emission itu diturunkan maka GDP juga akan ikut turun, atau malah ada kemungkinan sebaliknya gitu, karena kan emisi ini berusaha untuk diturunkan, tapi ada kemungkinan juga nanti munculnya carbon tax ini membuat harga-harga juga mungkin semakin naik gitu ya Bu. Itu yang pertama. Yang kedua terkait dengan carbon tax sendiri, saya mungkin masih kebayangnya pajak biasa ya Bu ya, saya nggak kebayang untuk yang carbon tax, tapi apakah carbon tax ini nanti tuh self assessment kayak kalau kita perusahaan atau individu gitu, atau nanti akan ada kayak assurance-nya atau penilaiannya untuk perusahaan untuk bisa memvalidasi apakah kuotanya ini dipakai semua atau ada yang tersisa gitu. Terima kasih.
Okay, so there are two questions here. Try to translate in again as well. So first question is about the risk that what happened if we reduce emission, what happened with the economy? Is the GDP going to be decreased as well? Because as we see in my first slide that there is sort of a correlation between the increase in GDP as well as the CO2 emissions. So that's a big question, and I think that's what the government is trying to say when they want to persuade international interventions. So that's also part of the Paris Agreement, that there needs to be some sort of support by developing countries so that these developed countries are able to maintain and even increase their GDP or even their growth while at the same time reducing their emissions. Because obviously reducing emissions is costly. It's costly for the environment, it's costly for the government, it's costly for almost all parties involved. And who should actually help with all these costs? And that's one of the big part of Paris Agreement, where there needs to be some support by the developed economies. So yes, obviously we recognize that there is a risk that the GDP will actually, not growing as much as is before, possibly, but the government is trying to avoid that by, as Mona has said as well, by, for example, having the money collected from the carbon tax poured back into the economy, to ensure that we actually transition toward the low carbon economy. So, for example, maybe when the government gets significant amount of revenue out of carbon tax, then the government then can increase subsidy for solar panel or for electric vehicles or for the use of gas or for other type of economy than that much more sort of low carbon. So again, yes, there is a risk, but the government itself obviously will try to avoid that happening. And again, then there is an expectation that developed countries also need to intervene in the area. That's why with the NDC you have two targets: your original target and how much you can achieve if you have help from others, from other countries in terms of funding and so on. So that's one thing. But maybe because you're asking about GDP growth, for me personally, then the questions will be, do we always need to grow? Right? I mean, is it a possibility that we can always grow infinitely, right? At what point we can say it's enough, right? We just need to be on a steady state, right? We just don't need to grow anymore. So that's for me is more on a more philosophical, basic economic questions, right? Like, do we really need to grow economically? Like, can we be just satisfied with the steady state that we have? But obviously, if we're like developing, in the process of being developed country, we still have people in the abject poverty. We do need to grow in order for raising these people from poverty level. But up to what point do we need to grow, right? That's, I think, for me also one of the big questions. There might be a different opinion from the main traditional economists like that. But yeah, that's my understanding on it. Because the natural resources is not infinite, right? But in order for us to ensure infinite growth, we assume that we'll need infinite resources, right? But natural resources is not infinite. There is a limit on things that nature can support us. So that's possibly one of the sort of main philosophical questions on my side in terms of GDP growth. And the next question is, how can we ensure that, or what type of, or how do we measure emissions for ensuring that the company has actually using their allowances, their quota or not? For carbon tax, we don't know yet, because again, we haven't got the detailed sort of regulations coming out from the Ministry of Finance. But if we're looking at the carbon market, they do have self-assessment, but there is a method, or there is a process called monitoring and verifications. So there is a verification process for that carbon credits. So for example, if someone is actually trying to sell, for example, an institution or a company, they're actually doing some reforestation project. They claim that they can absorb a certain amount of emissions. Obviously, that will be self-assessment. They themselves need to calculate how much emission that they absorb from the atmosphere, using what mechanism and so on. And someone appointed by the government will need to verify that. So there is a verification mechanisms going on. So only the verified certificates can be traded in the carbon market. We're not sure yet about tax, because again, we haven't got the sort of regulations coming, but there is a possibility that there will be some sort of verifications process. I'm not sure whether that's going to be a verifications process as such that we have in the carbon trading mechanisms or carbon market mechanisms, or is it going to be more on the audit or assurance? Because we do have ISO for greenhouse gases, right? And again, as we see here, the public accountant bodies actually also issued the exposure draft for assurance on carbon credit. So maybe that's going to be an option in the future. But me personally, I haven't got an idea because I haven't got information on it. So I think later on when we have the detailed regulation, then we have a bit more clarity on it. Oh, okay. There's two questions.
Okay, so we have another question from Zoom. Let me read it. So basically, the question is a bit technical. So in calculating the carbon emission for a company in a consolidation, do we calculate for an entity like company or for the whole consolidation? For example, in PLN or electricity company, state electricity company, they have a lot of subsidiaries which are not related to electricity. So yeah, do PLN group should be calculated as a group or as an entity?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Pak Habibi. So there is an actually different answer for different sort of standards. So if we look at from the perspective for the purpose of carbon market, again, I'm talking about carbon market because we already have it. We don't have the regulation for carbon tax, okay? So I cannot answer for carbon tax. For carbon market is actually sort of entity. So one of the main targeted participants of carbon market, Indonesia Carbon Exchange, is actually the 99 facility, 99 pembangkit listrik. So they already counted how many power plant facility that will need to use this carbon market mechanism. So the allowances will be set up based on this facility. So maybe like one, let's say, one facility, one Indonesia Power, for example, or every sort of power plant facility, they will have some sort of allowances, and then if if their actual emission is more than the allowance, then they need to also pursue some carbon offsetting and so on through the carbon market. So that's from the perspective of carbon market. But there is a regulations from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, ASDM. There is a regulations that in one of my slides about in bahasa is tata laksana penyelenggaraan pasar karbon untuk ketenaga listrikan. So there is a specific regulation on it for electricity parties, basically PLN and all the related parties, on how it should be done. So my suggestion is going through the regulations, but from my understanding, it's going to be for each facility for the purpose of that. For the purpose of sustainability reporting disclosures, like IFRS S1, S2, or if you want to talk about GRI, or maybe POJK, if you are under the rules of OJK, for example, it's going to be for entity. So maybe like if one entity have different facility, right? Or maybe if one entity have 2 power plants and so on, if you are looking at the context of carbon market, then you have to calculate the emission for each facility, and then there will be, the allowances for each facility. But if you were talking about sustainability reporting or ESG reporting or other type of disclosure, it's for one entity. So you just add it up for each facility, and that's for one entity. And if it's for IFRS S1 and S2, actually, they're pretty much having the same reporting boundary. The emissions reported has to be within the same reporting entity as for your financial statement. So if PLN have a financial statement for all its consolidated subsidiaries, then when they want to create sustainability reporting according to IFRS S1 and S2, for example, then the reporting entity needs to be the same. So the PLN has to also consolidate the emission data for all of its subsidiaries as well. They have to sort of add up how much is the total emissions. But then again, the issue is, what if there is some sort of a quote-unquote intercompany transactions going on in that consolidation process? So that's another complexity that it's going to be, I think it's going to be discussed in the next few months or even few years when we in the process of applying IFRS S1 and S2. So I hope that answered the questions. Moga-moga menjawab, Pak Habibie.
Okay, another question. This is quite long, so wait. Okay, so basically the question is about reducing the carbon emission by using the alternative new energy or renewable. So that we don't only reduce the carbon emission by carbon emission to green energy, but we also change the fossil fuel as the main source. Okay, so
it's quite a long question. I'm trying to digest the questions. Coba. Okay. Yeah. Maybe I'll try to answer it.
Okay, so maybe I'll try to answer it, and maybe later Mona can join in if you want to, Mona. So I think it's a very long question in Bahasa Indonesia. Yeah, so I think from what I've read, it's about how can we ensure that carbon emission reductions initiatives also in parallel, we should also have to ensure that there is an initiative to sort of use the alternatives, right, for carbon. How the effort to reduce emissions can work in parallel with the initiative to develop new technology, to develop new energy sources other than carbon, if that's if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct, Pak Abdi? If you can, I don't know, maybe say something. Is that correct in terms of conclusion of what your question is? Yeah, correct. Okay. Yeah. In my understanding, the good thing about all these initiatives to basically make people pay for their emission is that we will have money available. And this money will be useful to later on again develop the technology that is needed. For example, in Indonesia, we have limited resources for us to develop like geothermal plants or wind turbine or maybe other type of energy sources, hydrogens and so on. Government obviously have limited money to fund all of it, and private sectors and individuals also have limited resources to change from just regular fossil fuel to that. And I think both of them can work together in a way that by having this carbon pricing per se, basically make people pay for the price of their carbon, then we will have resources available to ensure that at the same time this money being used to again develop toward this more sort of environmentally friendly technology, alternatives and so on. And obviously it's going to be more complex in a way that concerns about how would the money being spent? Is it going to be spent properly? Is it going to be spent in a way that in the most effective or the most efficient alternatives to replace fossil fuel, for example? That's another complication. But then I think it's worth to be asked, but it's needs a lot more discussions on it, because obviously we need to make sure that we have the money available first before we design that. Or we can design that, but I think there needs to be a system in place as well by the government and regulators or even the market to ensure that the funding is being spent properly. And sometimes not only from the government, private sectors as well, if they have this disincentive to use fossil fuel, and they might start to consider other alternatives, right? So if using fossil fuel is getting more expensive, then hopefully it can also induce the companies to have some sort of innovations or R&D or going on to find out what will be the alternatives that I as company can use instead of this fossil fuel, right? And that's hopefully can also trigger the innovation sort of hopefully movement toward more low carbon economy or low carbon transitions. I hope that help with the questions. Mona, do you want to add something to it?
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's enough. Mona unfortunately had to leave earlier. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, maybe our time for the question and answer session is up. So to sum up, one of the initiatives to achieve net zero carbon emission is by enforcing carbon tax, which may change consumer behavior, since they need to pay more expensive for using product with high carbon content. This also comes with costs, such as investing, upscaling workforce skill, but hopefully it'll create job opportunity and economic growth at the same time. So Indonesia is currently underway in achieving the net zero target of 2060 with several policies and initiatives formally set in NDC, nationally determined contributions. Some of them include carbon exchange, currently in place, and carbon tax, which will be effective in 2025. And how does accounting take role in climate change? Well, we have several examples. In management accounting, it's mainly related to measuring carbon emission and associated costs for decision making. In financial accounting, we may have a lot of discussions regarding accounting methods in cap and trade schemes. And lastly, accounting is also about reporting and disclosing significant activities related to sustainability. So we also have several standards currently in place, as well as to be imposed in the near future. Hopefully, this is not the end of our discussion, and instead, this is the beginning of other discussions related to sustainability topics. So, okay, I'm afraid our session is up today. Thank you everyone for attending the seminar, both online or offline. And I would like to express my gratitude to our speakers, Ms. Mona and Bu Luluk. Thank you so much. And now I hand the session back to the MC. Thank you.
Baik, terima kasih. Tadi kita telah mendengarkan pandangan dan pemikiran luar biasa dari para narasumber. Semoga ilmu yang diberikan dapat bermanfaat untuk kita semua. Maka, berakhirlah acara kita pada hari ini. Terima kasih kepada seluruh peserta atas perhatian dan partisipasi Anda yang sangat berarti. Kami juga ingin mengucapkan terima kasih kepada seluruh panitia dan pihak yang telah mendukung acara ini sehingga dapat berjalan dengan sukses. Oke, mungkin akan dimulai sesi foto. Oh iya, sesi foto untuk partisipan di Zoom mungkin boleh on cam. Baik. Screenshot akan dimulai pada 3, 2, 1.
Oke.
1 kali. Sudah. Maka acara ini kami akhiri. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih. Lo mau nanya apa? Aduh, panjang. Apa-apa.